Welcome to the Book Binge. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today we're doing yet another Michael Crichton book review. Who knew I'd be doing way more of these in the last few months than Stephen King books? Kind of surprised by that myself, but that course will be correcting itself in due time. Even so, today's video is the first book in this collection and from which the cover of this binding gets the cover from. You know, redundant, but that's all okay. We're covering Congo today, the fourth, I believe, Crichton novel that I've read up to this point in kind of my new reading journey. I read Jurassic Park and the Lost World several years ago, barely remember anything about them, don't really count those at this point. I will be rereading them probably near the end of my Crichton journey, but this is the fourth Crichton book that I've read, and today I want to talk a little bit about it because, you know, it's one of his more popular novels. It's one of the more well-known novels that he has written. And it's also quite good. So let's just jump into things right now with the good of Congo, since I always start off with the good. The main thing that I want to praise Congo for is that the first third or so of the book is very, very good. The setup within all of that is actually incredible. Crichton is generally pretty good with setups, getting you kind of into the action and into the questions associated with whatever the plot is going to be talking about. Is very effective in doing this, just as kind of a rule as far as I've experienced, and Congo is no exception to this rule. The conceit of the plot is interesting in that you kind of start off from one angle of it, where the plot is kind of an expedition for diamonds for whatever reason, following a prologue that is actually kind of a really chilling scene, all things considered. Actually, you add in a little bit of an antagonist in that setup, in, you know, the searching for diamonds, the expedition for diamonds somewhere in the middle of the Congo in Africa. And this antagonist is some sort of mysterious, who knows what it is, but it might be a gorilla, it might be not. So you get an aspect of mystery associated with this conceit, with this drive for one set of the protagonists. You include a new character into the story with a lot of really good backstory, and we'll talk about that in a minute, between having Amy and Elliot. These two characters in particular, if you know, you know, are great, and they add a great, interesting dynamic to the book as a whole that, you know, basically no other book really does, just on account of what Amy is. Really enjoyed all that stuff. Initiating the expedition proper, or at least the second part of the expedition in the aftermath of the prologue. And being able to explore that from a couple of different primary vantages was generally really, really great. Namely, setting up different motivations for different characters was also really fun within the setup portion of the book as well. The stakes and the settings and general scenario encounters that Michael Crichton comes up with in this book are legit, absolutely cool. One of Michael Crichton's strengths as a writer, one of his greatest strengths even, it might even be like straight up the thing that he is best at for me up to this point, confusing me in a metatextual way. And what I mean by that is Crichton is very good at making me unsure of what is real and what is not within his books. His books are always crafted in such a way, in such a vein, that you're almost willing to believe that, like, this might have been something that actually happened. Feels like something that is real to a portion of history, even the recent history based off of the time that any given book is published. He relies on real-world science, real-world math in some cases, real-world studies. There's a lot of his novels straight up have bibliographies to them, which is not something you typically include in fiction. That is because a lot of his books incorporate study material and incorporate this real-world science and statistics and other stuff like this. This type of material makes the line between what is fact and what is fiction within his books incredibly blurry, and I love that. It's almost surreal reading any of his books and being like, wait a minute, did this actually happen? What if this is true? What if this is based on like real studies? what if this is like actual real world information, and what if this is he just completely making up for the scenario that he's writing this novel in. And I really love getting my mind bent by that kind of stuff. Really enjoy that aspect of Crichton's work. I just find that kind of thing very compelling all of the time, and that's why, quite frankly, I enjoy Crichton. The Andromeda Strain had the exact same thing happen to me, because the sort of like author's introduction type of thing, like straight up says, this is something that actually happened. I got all this research from this kind of stuff, and I'm revealing it to you now. Obviously, that book is still a novel, but just Crichton's attempt at making the stuff feel real is cool. I really respect that. I really appreciate it, and I think it's generally very well done. Overall, I would also add that the different characters within Congo are very distinct. The settings are very distinct as well. You never really feel like you're running in circles, going through kind of the same stuff, living in a time loop, so to speak, as far as like where you are actually set at within the book. This is not necessarily a problem with previous Crichton books, but let's say like The Terminal Man and Andromeda Strain both kind of suffer from being in very familiar location for much of the time. They have kind of their own different settings at times, especially The Terminal Man. It's not completely relegated to one place. In fact, The Terminal Man kind of has a little bit of like a little bit more thriller to it, a little bit more thriller DNA to it than any of the three other Crichton books that I've read so far for this booktube journey of the 4 books that I'm at this point have reviewed or am currently reviewing right now. The Andromeda Strain, however, is an example of a book that has very few settings. In fact, the vast majority of that book is set within one particular bunker where they're studying a specific unknown contagion of something, not really understanding what that is, needing to figure it out, and needing to find a way to neutralize it. And the book is very effective. It's very good in that setting, but sometimes you feel like it's like, okay, well, could we do something a little different? Well, Congo has a little bit more to it as far as that's concerned. The characters are also a little bit less bread and butter this time around, where even in like The Terminal Man especially, I felt like a lot of the characters, their differentiation, the characteristics that Crichton gave them to make them different from one another, felt a little bit more superficial, relatively speaking. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing for the purpose of his books. I don't think the characters are the main thing you're reading a Crichton novel for, but he does a better job of that kind of thing in Congo. Rather than focusing on the benign characteristics of the people, you're focusing on actual motivations to some degree, rather than having singular, more drab kind of office or science-y type of locations. You have something a little bit more dynamic in the jungle, the actual Congo within Africa. So all this stuff feels a little bit more distinct, a little bit more diverse, and it's great. You include, the kind of wildlife that is associated herein, including with some of the characters, and you just have something that's really fun and incorporates, the drive to solve a mystery as pretty much the primary focus for a good chunk of the book, and follows that through and executes on that pretty well in general. Along that same line, you have great discoveries, great conflicts that come from all of this stuff between different characters and their motivations. You have some great reveals to certain mysteries throughout the book. The questions that really need answers at any point throughout Congo are handled pretty great, in my opinion, and the reveals to implicit mysteries are often quite satisfying, and as I kind of suggested, various conflicts are pretty engaging when you have characters kind of butting heads with one another in an organic fashion. But now we're going to move on to the bad of Congo, because there's some minor complaints that I have about it. I would say probably the chief complaint is that Dr. Ross, the particular character Dr. Ross, her POV feels heavily underutilized compared to Elliot's POV. I'm not going to go into detail, no spoilers in this video, but it definitely felt like Dr. Ross was not utilized enough for at least a portion of what Crichton was trying to do with the book. It kind of makes sense why she's a little bit less focused on, so that the climax essentially comes as a little bit more of a surprise. But I don't think that the climax was supposed to come off as a surprise. Felt like some of those motivational conflicts, the differences between Elliot and Dr. Ross, should have been a little bit more pronounced and tugged a little bit more at the through line of the story, and it just didn't, because Dr. Ross, through almost like everything outside of the setup, outside of the first third of the book, is like never the POV for some reason. And that just feels kind of weird. It feels like you're missing an entire aspect of the story by having her be essentially missing from the narrative, the actual narration part of the story. As a result, the plot also occasionally started to drag a bit at places due to a slight lack of variety on this front. Furthermore, a little bit more complaint on Dr. Ross's front is her actual motivations not seeming to be fleshed out enough. Obviously, like, this is largely due to her POV not really being utilized through most of the book. As she diverges from the rest of the group, especially Elliot, kind of as I was saying before, you expect to see a little bit more of this actually being fleshed out in the book, and it's just kind of not. You get an attempt at the very end in the actual climax to do all this, but then you realize that, like, no, you just had like 100, 200 pages even of the book. Not quite 200. I think this copy, Congo, is only about 250 pages. You have probably about 125, 150 pages in which Ross's motivations are largely not covered to any notable degree. So yeah, you get stuff that kind of feels a little bit underwhelming, and end up with an exposition dump kind of style of like manifesto in her head as kind of the climax is happening. This doesn't fully work for me. Like I said, it kind of felt like it was meant to be like a surprise, like a sort of quasi mystery type of thing, but I don't think that's what was actually meant to be the case. So it just ended up feeling a little bit clunky in that regard. All things considered, it's a pretty minor complaint, but I feel like it was one of the weaker aspects of the book as a whole. Also, as far as Crichton's books go, you probably know that science-y type of stuff, a little bit more of the hard science, and not hard science in the way that sci-fi typically means it, but more in the like actual like numbers and kind of doing the math, so to speak, writing down the math within a book. Crichton does this sometimes in his books. Usually he does it pretty effectively. I would say the Andromeda Strain, for example, did that very effectively. Congo did that pretty good in the first like third whenever that material was utilized, and actually I should say that every time it was utilized it was done well. The problem for me was just that this material was serviceable for the story, you know, like it wasn't anything that really changed or really added to the book. It didn't drag it down, but there was a little bit too much of it in the final third, in that it felt like you had, you know, a short chapter of like a little bit of actual story progression, and then you had basically an entire chapter to follow that was mostly just doing like a little bit of explanation, getting a little bit more backstory and kind of expositional science stuff in there a little bit, and not all of that felt entirely necessary. So it felt like Crichton was still kind of trying to find his groove, even though he did this and balanced this quite well through the book up to that point. The last third had a little bit more occasions of like, here's some of the backstory, here's some of the research that I did basically for this book right here in the book, and not all of it was actually necessary. Some of it, in fact, quite a bit of it in the last third was tangential, so that ended up dragging the story down just a little bit near the end, unfortunately. Like I said, it's definitely not bad. It's serviceable when it's there. There's just a little bit too much of it. I think Andromeda probably balanced the general use of this type of material a little bit better. But now we move into the ugly, in which I'm actually going to give you like my biggest criticism of the book, and that is that the ending as a whole is a huge miss. And what do I mean by the ending? I basically mean the last handful of chapters and the epilogue. There's two major reasons why the ending is largely a miss. The first reason is that I don't really like the direction of the climax. This is a little bit more of a personal preference thing. I think the direction of the climax is fine, even though I wanted something elsewise. It's not inherently bad, because I could have been on board for it, but that gets me into the second major problem of the climax, and that's that it was very underdone. It was very undercooked. It's like if you ask for a medium steak and you just get like a bare, maybe not even medium rare, like below even medium rare steak. Like you have a promise of something that's good, but like it's not there, you know. It's trying, and it might be acceptable to some people, but it's not quite there. Firstly, the actual climax as it exists in Congo feels very rushed, due in no small part to the lack of Dr. Ross's POV. Some of her motivation, some of her decision making in the closing chapters doesn't really make total sense until she just kind of says it, basically. And this comes as a surprise when the first third of the book is so effective in incorporating both Elliot and Dr. Ross as basically the main characters of the book, I would argue. So for Dr. Ross to not really have much POV through the entire back half, essentially, means that this climax is, like I said, a little bit rushed. You don't fully believe that her character would do this thing. Like, you kind of do, you get it because the book tells you that that's why she would do it, but you don't really feel that with her because you didn't get to be in her POV very much. Something that I implied a little bit earlier as well is that Dr. Ross is basically the POV in the primary portion of the climax, the chapter that is the climax of the book. And Ross is the POV of this and basically dumps the entirety of her thought process for the last third of the book into this one chapter. This exacerbates the problem of it feeling rushed as a result. There's just not enough time to really properly flesh out that thought process. She just needed to be a more active POV through a little bit more of the book for this to feel believable, the way that she diverges from, say, Elliot, like I was talking about previously. And then beyond the fact that I feel like the climax is a little bit rushed, the epilogue, the resolution is just straight up terrible. There's zero resolution at all. Like, you have one chapter that acts as the supposed resolution to the book following the climax, but it doesn't actually resolve anything. You're still in the middle of, minor spoilers, I guess, you're still in the middle of an escape sequence in this last chapter of the book, and then it just ends. Like, it doesn't even really finish out that scene. You just kind of have a, like, sort of ending, and then it's like, oh yeah, the escape happened, and then you have the epilogue that's just a couple of pages that's like, this is where the characters are now. So there's just nothing really substantial to resolve the book even after the climax happens, and that is easily the biggest sin of it. That is the most disappointing part of this book. My essential solution for Congo is just to add more material. Like I said, this binding that includes 3 books in here. Sphere is like 300 pages, for example. It's one of Crichton's longer books. Congo's only 250 pages or so in this edition. It could have stood to have easily another 50 pages added, and that's largely because of the climax feeling a little rushed and the resolution just essentially not existing. So the book is split out into multiple days of the expedition: day 1, day 2, day 3, all the way up through day 13. Day 13 is where the climax and the resolution happens. If you added on a few more chapters to the end of day 13 here to actually finish off that sequence, to actually get out of there, you would have, you know, a satisfying escape sequence following the climax. You would have a satisfying ending of the climax, because it's not even really fully complete until this, you know, sort of falling action type thing is actually done. So you needed a little bit more material there. Then following that, there should have been a day 14. Even if day 14 wasn't long, you needed to add a day 14 there for a little bit more wind down and to allow the characters and you as the reader to kind of process what you just experienced in day 13. Then instead of the epilogue just being 1 or 2 pages, you should have added on like an entire like epilogue section rather than just like a 1 chapter thing, because many of the chapters in this book are just a few pages. The epilogue's kind of the same thing. There's multiple chapters within each day of the expedition, as an example. So if you just made the epilogue like an entire section similar to the way the days are formatted, and had like multiple chapters to the epilogue, in which each chapter of the epilogue was doing the same kind of like, this is where all the characters are now, quote unquote now, each chapter dedicated to one of the characters, rather than only having 1 or 2 pages total where like a couple paragraphs are dedicated to each character, you might have something a little bit more substantial and actually satisfying to finish off the book. Like, I think these types of expansions would do a lot for Congo, because instead of having a great book that is just kind of left a little bit disappointing because of like no real good ending or conclusion, you would have a book that really goes into that material, and you would be able to explore some of the material that felt like it wasn't fully explored during the expedition itself. And that's another thing that feels a little bit disappointing. Even with the climax that Crichton chose to go with for the book, which again, I wasn't fully on board for, but if Crichton had just expanded that material a little bit, I would have been totally fine with it, been like, you know what, I get what you were going for, I accept this. But because he didn't actually do anything with that and didn't fully finish it off, I was left very much wanting. Really disappointing end to what is otherwise the best Crichton book that I've read so far. Which I guess leads me into the recommendation. You can kind of tell I'm a little bit mixed on Congo as a result of really liking a lot of the beginning especially, but the ending being very disappointing. I do think that you should read Congo as just the book itself. That's because if you're interested in Crichton at all, or if you've read any of his books and enjoyed them, this is basically the best one of the four of them that I've read so far. Between Andromeda Strain, Terminal Man, Great Train Robbery, and this one, this is the best one, at least for like 2/3 of the book. I think, say, the Andromeda Strain is the most consistent one, because it doesn't end on such a nothing burger note of an ending where it's not even an ending. But this one has the highest highs of any of those four books. So if you like Crichton, or if you're interested in Crichton, this one is generally considered to be one of his better books, barring the ending. So it is worth reading for that. But if you do choose to read it, you have to understand that the end's going to leave you wanting, and like, maybe that's okay. I think it's okay. I still like the book more than I didn't. I was just sad that I could only really give the book 4 stars on Goodreads because there was no ending, basically. Whereas I wanted to be able to give it 5 because I was really enjoying it, and the first third especially is just fantastic setup. Easily the best of that kind of stuff that Crichton's done up to this point. If you can forgive or anticipate and thus not be as bothered by a bad ending, you ought to be overall fine reading Congo. So my recommendation is that you do read it if you have any interest in Crichton. And if you're watching this video, you probably have some interest in Crichton, so I do recommend it. Just go in ahead of time knowing that the ending is not great. Anyway, that is my review for Congo. Definitely a good bit longer than I expected it to be. I've had plenty of book reviews so far this year that have all been longer than I expect them to be for one reason or another. I think I just end up taking more notes than I need, anticipating that I'll be able to work through them a lot quicker. But that's just kind of the way things go sometime. I think this will probably be the last Michael Crichton review that I actually do for a short while, because as far as my independent standalone books are concerned in my TBR for the near future, Stephen King's going to be taking a little bit more of that burden for largely the rest of the year. There's still a couple more Crichton books I plan to read. I want to read Eaters of the Dead next, and then Sphere, or vice versa. We'll see. I haven't quite decided on that yet. I still want to get to those two this year, but I have a few Stephen King books that I need to get to more or less first. We'll see what my priority levels on that are for, but I'm looking forward to that. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope it was worth your watch. If you enjoyed this review, I have a lot more reviews coming up that you should be able to catch over the next few months, basically the rest of March, and then the bulk of April and like nearly the entirety of May are just a whole bunch of book reviews, just on account of me having to work through some stuff a little bit early. So if book reviews are your thing, then you should definitely consider subscribing, because I do a lot of those. Actually, I do a lot more book reviews than I feel like most other people tend to do, especially relative to my non-book review content on the channel. So I hope you are willing to stick around for that. Either way, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.